Hello, everybody.
Hey,
yeah, baby.
that music played.
Form, eh?
That music played, and we didn't have any glitches. No, it was beautiful. I heard it all.
We have a brand new platform, and it looks great. The picture's fantastic. You even look good, Pete.
Well, thank you, young man.
You're quite welcome.
To you as well. Ditto to you as well.
Exciting program today, and it couldn't have come at a better time, I suppose. For those of you who are regulars on fishingcanada.com, you know, Pete and I have been dabbling in some scientific blogging as of late, especially as it pertains to largemouth bass, because that happens to be only the most favorite fish in the world for us. But also because bass season is quickly opening up in this part of the world here in southern Ontario. In fact, some of it's going to open up this weekend, right, Pete? Up on
tomorrow morning, zone 17, zone 20, 16 maybe, 16. I think.
Yeah.
15, and others are next weekend. So there's going to be tomorrow, and then next Saturday, and after that, shoo, she's a free for all. Bass is open, everything's open, and giddy up.
So we've seen fit to put out some blogs that got a little scientific, and certainly it pushed our knowledge to the limit. There was things that we've learned from trial and error, being in the field for almost 4 decades, chasing bass, doing it for a living. So, you know, no matter how smart or lack thereof you might be, you know, when you spend that much time in the field, you learn things. You learn things by making mistakes. And that's basically what we've been writing the last few blogs. So our crack research department thought that they would reach out to somebody who might know some of this stuff that we're spewing about on a little more scientific level.
Exactly. I'll tell you what, before you introduce him, I'll tell you what, Ange and I are living proof that, yeah, we are gaining knowledge in the world of fishing, in this case bass, but it has taken those 40 years to learn what we think is it's a lot probably, but it's very little by little as it goes. The season's so short in Canada, so it's taken us forever. So it's going to be nice and refreshing to get somebody that scientifically can either prove what we know or give us new stuff. It's going to be great. So go ahead, answer.
I'm glad you said either prove what we know is correct, or maybe give us some new stuff, because, you know, as far as we're concerned, it's not our experience is not scientific. It is based on our experience. You do things repeatedly over and over again, and eventually you find out what's right and what's wrong, what works and what doesn't work.
Practical versus theory, right? We're practical, not really the theory of it. So
exactly. So we thought we would bring on this next guest to maybe discuss some of those theories that we have and see if we're right, and maybe give us some new ones to work on. His name is Dr. Stephen Cooke. He has been on the radio program, Outdoor Journal Radio, several times on the Fan 590 with me. And we thought he'd be the very, very first scientific element that we would add to these webcasts. And perfect timing, because bass season opens up this weekend in a lot of places, like we just talked about. He's with the University of Carleton University in the Ottawa area, but his team and his whole department is very mobile. He travels around studying recreational fishing. So what a perfect guy to bring on. Welcome to the program, Dr. Cooke. How are you, Stephen?
I'm well, thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Good to see you, buddy. Good to see you. We're looking forward to this, for sure.
By the way, Stephen is sitting at his cottage, and
there we go,
on the Rideau, right?
Yeah. Hiding at the cottage, doing a little bit of writing early in the morning, late in the afternoon, and spending some good time with the kids.
Perfect. So, Stephen, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, taking time out from your recreational time. But as we said at the beginning, there couldn't be a better opportunity to bring you on because bass season is right on the cusp of opening. It's at our doorstep, and boy, what a great opportunity! All the people that are hopefully listening and joining us today, a great opportunity to get some firsthand scientific knowledge that may help improve their fishing.
Not the crap.
One of those waiting for this.
Not the crap that spews out of hands in my mouth. We're going to get some real stuff this time.
So, Stephen, go ahead, Pete.
Are you a bass guy, Stephen? Right off the bat, are you? I mean, I know I'm sure you're diverse, but do you like bass fishing?
Yeah, definitely. Largemouth are number one for me.
Attaboy. Look at that. There's three
I
students
love
on the
it.
screen that all love it.
Well, you're seeing right now, in my opinion, one of the best kept largemouth bass fisheries anywhere. That Rideau system is just insane. But one thing I noticed the last time that I did fish it, it is pretty quirky. It can be very humbling as well. And my first question I have to ask you, because you wear two hats, right? You're the scientist and then you're the bass nut. Have you ever been humbled in your fishing days on the water? Have you ever been humbled to the point where you say, wow, maybe I don't know it all,
Yeah. I'm gonna hit on this right at the beginning. Man, I'm probably one of the most frustrated anglers out there because I should know this.
Yeah.
Spent way too much time, in university, way too much time with my nose in a book. And I think that's useful for helping to contextualize some things, but time on the water really is what matters. And I think I've probably learned more with either fishing rod in hand or with mask and snorkel. Farting around in the shallow water about what fish do and how they behave. And, we'll share some of those frustrations later. I've got, thousands of dollars worth of equipment that can tell me exactly where fish are and what they're doing, and I still can't catch them.
You know what? It's the same thing with like in Stephen's case. He's a biologist that's a fisherman, but it's the same thing for all fishermen. Angela and I put in so many hours. We talked about on the water, years on the water, and it'll work, and all of a sudden, boom, you're humbled because now it's not working. You know what I mean? You're saying, oh my God, I got to do something different. So it's such an intricate sport, and it's, it's like a bass tournament. It's not man against man; it's man against beast. And then you got the other guys that maybe did a better job of it. It's a living creature that we're going against in every species, and it's not easy. That's for sure. There are times when it's easy, but it's not always easy. That's for sure.
So let's set it up. I think for the folks that are joining us now, let's tell them exactly what it is that you do, and kind of paint a picture of the whole team and where you guys move to and how you work with fish.
Sure. So I'm a professor. So yes, I teach in the classroom, but in the big scheme of things, not a ton of time on that side of things. A lot of it's really hands-on mentoring, working with the next generation of fisheries scientists, whether they be undergrad students or doing their honors thesis or being summer students. We've got master's students and PhD students. Then we also have postdoctoral fellows. So those are people that already are themselves doctors, and they are in our lab to further refine their knowledge. And it's sort of that waiting space between having a PhD and actually getting a permanent position. We study wild fish in the wild. That's how I describe things. On campus at Carleton, I have 0 live fish. I am the worst. I can keep a goldfish alive if my life depended on it. And I realize that, and I don't even try. So we go to the field. We take the lab to the field. So we have a fleet of 6 vehicles. We have 5 boats, and we traipse across the countryside studying fish in their natural environment. We've got a pretty large team. I've got 40 members. And just today, we just got our Ministry of Natural Resource and Forestry scientific collection permit for this year. The offices have been shut down. Aside from the enforcement staff who are out there making sure that there aren't violations, everybody else has been working at home. So today is a very exciting day for our team as well. I'd like to say they're hitting the water, but that's not entirely true because, as you know, at the beginning of the season, that means filling up flat tires, making sure that the batteries are all ready to go, finding all that equipment. And in our case, most of that equipment has sat idle since November. So it's not just, that we've left it for the last 2 or 3 months. Idle for the entire winter period. So we're in the process of trying to get ramped up. We normally work around the world, but right now we're obviously working quite close to home. We're doing work in Quebec at Cooke, which is a fishing preserve that some of you might be familiar with, and then doing work in and around the Rideau system. So yeah,
nice. Pete and I were just yesterday. We had FNC1 in the water for the first time this year, getting the kinks out of some of the equipment. So we understand completely what you're talking about, for sure. So let's talk about bass. Obviously, that's what we're all here for. Want to talk about bass. A couple of first things that I'd like to get out of the way. We are, in my opinion, based on the weather patterns so far this year, we are, I'm going to say, 2 or 3 weeks down the timeline where we would normally find ourselves, even compared to last year, but certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, that timeline seems to be shifting down with regards to spawn. So if we could start with that, fill us in on what you're expecting to find out there in the days ahead as your team goes out. Are you looking at starting with a spawning situation with largemouth, or do you think it's pretty much done?
Yeah, for largemouth, we're more or less done. The exception would be the St. Lawrence River, where it certainly takes a little bit longer to warm up. But even there, a lot of the coastal embayments where the largemouth are, they go early. It's really the smallmouth bass that get delayed there. I bet I could probably find a few largemouths still guarding fry balls here on Big Rideau. But if I found any that were still on nests, they'd be little guys that are, I'm showing you a 9-inch fish there, that would be maybe given reproduction a shot for the first time, and they're probably not going to be successful anyways. So these fish would have gone pretty early this year. It's already warm and stable, where, as you said, I think we're 2 to 3 weeks ahead relative to where we normally would be. We're already up. Water temps are 24 to 26 degrees and stable. That is something that we normally don't hit until, a week or two into July. And it usually doesn't go much above that. If we go above 26 degrees Celsius, that's pretty uncommon.
And now I bet you, I got a feeling right now, though, Lake Ontario for smallmouth, they're probably just on beds, like out of the Duck Islands and in that really cold water area. I bet they're either holding on beds or guarding, or just getting onto beds. Maybe not even spawning yet, some of them, I'm assuming. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Water temperature means everything for fish in general, and certainly it means everything in terms of reproduction. And it's not just, you'll read in books about a temperature with smallmouth or largemouth, maybe it's 14 or 15 degrees Celsius, but it's not just hitting that temperature. It's hitting that and staying above it. So if at night, or 2 days later you have a storm and it goes back to 12 degrees, those dads will all bail from their nests, and they do that because they know that their eggs will die, or their offspring will die. So it's not just a matter of hitting those thresholds, it's hitting them and staying stable and above them. So usually it's not when water temps hit a surface temp of 14 or 15, it's usually a couple degrees higher than that. So you're guaranteed that you're not getting those nighttime chills.
And Steve, will they reset? Now, those males that bail out, are they looking to start all over again, or are they done for the year?
Yeah, some of the ones that are on the plumper side, the ones that are in better condition, will go for it again. Usually there's lots of females hanging around that want to choose good males to give their eggs. The males build the nests and then defend them. And as long as they haven't spent too much on that investment in defense, they'll go again. But they do take reproductive holidays. Some of the work that we've done in Eastern Ontario here shows that, maybe 1 year a given male will reproduce, and then he'll take 2 years off, then he'll come back for 2 years, and then we'll never see him again. Reproduction for these animals is challenging, especially the males. Everybody thinks that bass are easy to catch on the nest, which is true, but it's not because they're hungry. It's because they're being good dads. They'll come along and they'll pluck up a lure, and they'll oftentimes pick it up by the tail. Say if it was a 4-inch plastic worm, they'll pick it up by the tail. And if you don't set the hook, they will take it away, they'll chew it a little bit, and then they'll spit it out. They'll spit it out 3 or 4 yards away from the nest, and then they'll come back. We've done lots of work, and in fact, their appetite hormones, which are the same appetite hormones that we have, that are associated with childhood obesity, things like ghrelin, are downregulated during the time that they're spawning. And it's the same reason why you don't eat a Big Mac and then jump on the treadmill. It's hard to engage in high level activity. You imagine playing doing anything that's high intensity. In the case of bass, chasing away predators when you've got a full belly. And so basically they take a pause on eating and focus on being good dads.
Wow.
So, okay, I got one for you, Stephen. I read from one of your things that you did that they will do the odd time, they'll do opportunistic feeding while on a nest. Is that correct then? They will eat a little bit?
Yeah, it's opportunistic, and it tends to be crayfish.
Oh, really?
You know, a crayfish in the right size that has, say, recently molted and is nice and soft. Any self-respecting bass that's on a nest will almost certainly slurp that up.
Okay.
But we do work where we try and catch bass on nests to study them, and it's, you know, it can be extremely frustrating because they do what I described. They'll pick it up and they'll swim away, and oftentimes they'll just pick it up right by that, you know, that last centimeter of a 4 or 6 inch worm, and then go spit it out elsewhere. And so for a lot of the work where we're actually trying to target them, we use very tiny baits. We're using 1/36-ounce jigs. We're using, you know, 2.5-inch tube jigs at biggest, just so that we don't have to play that game 100 times while we sit there and shiver to death. So yeah, trying to stave off the hypothermia.
Good point.
Let's set the record straight right now. What Stephen is talking about is scientific research. So they've invested a lot of time in trying to catch bass on beds so they can document it. I want to talk right now is the perfect time. Recently, I would say in the last 6 months to a year, there's been a lot of discussion about spawning fish and fishing for them, especially as our weather patterns have changed. You know, we're more frequently faced with the opportunity to fish spawning fish. Then we've got regulations such as in Northern Ontario where it's wide open and you can fish spawning fish up there. In fact, Pete and I went up a couple of years ago to shoot a Fishing Canada episode about that. And so there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of discussion, and our southern friends have piped in saying that they fish beds all the time in Florida. It's part of this, the way they fish. So what's the big deal, right? So I'd like you to maybe address that and give us your opinion without us tainting it, without us telling you what we think. I'd like you to tell us what you think. Is it appropriate to be fishing spawning bass?
Sure. Okay. Well, let's start with Florida and get it off the table. Florida bass are actually a different species, and they have an entirely different biology, and they don't have to deal with what we see up here as winter. But we could still talk about Tennessee, right, where they fish for bass. The big difference between Ontario and most of the waters to the south is that we do not stock bass. You cannot find a provincial hatchery in this province that raises a single smallmouth bass or largemouth bass. We depend entirely on natural reproduction. And there's not many places in North America that can say that. So I think that's the first thing to remember. And that means that's the hallmark of well-managed fisheries. That's something that I think we should be very proud of and try to sustain. The work that we've done and the amount of time that I've spent with mask and snorkel on clearly shows me that when we mess with bass that are on the nest, that those animals are not better off. There's a strong likelihood that they will abandon, and anglers are pretty proficient at being able to target those animals, especially smallmouth bass. I would say smallmouth bass are substantially more vulnerable to preseason angling than largemouth bass. They're simply more aggressive on the nest. We can catch 10 nesting bass in the time it takes us to catch one nesting smallmouth, in the same time it takes us to catch one nesting largemouth. I'm not saying that largemouth aren't catchable. It's just that the smallmouth are hyper aggressive when they're on the nest. Their nests tend to be easier to see. They're not, behind 3 stumps and, in super shallow water. Their nests tend to be white and glow against this background of slightly darker colored rocks. So, there's lots of arguments that are made, and certainly a bass that's in Pennsylvania is no different than a bass that's here, but the fisheries management systems are different, and stocking is a big part of that. We do know that release rates for bass here are quite quite high. Somewhere around 90% of smallmouth and largemouth that are captured around the year here are released. That certainly fits in with why we can have such great fisheries. So giving up a little bit of the season and giving those fish a break is something that makes good sense. So it's something that I'm supportive of, and will continue to advocate for protecting those nesting fish.
What about the Zone 20 issue that was up now? They're talking about opening the bass season early and closing it before the spawn, and then extending the smallmouth open or 2 weeks later than that. What's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's certainly fascinating, and I love the creativity. A couple of things come to mind. One is the complexity. So we're trying to make fishing simple and accessible to the masses. And the guidebook, the sport fishing regs got to the point where it was as thick as a telephone book, and you had to have a law degree to figure out when you were able to fish and where you could fish. And when you add complex regulations like that, we're kind of going backwards in that sense. That said, I do like anything that gives anglers another opportunity to hit the water, as long as it doesn't have negative consequences. I'm unsure why bass need to be closed through to say early May. I don't know why we need them to be closed in March. I don't know why we need them to be closed in December, other than the fact that they do aggregate in the winter. So if you guys have been ice fishing, you can go ice fishing 20 times, never catch a bass. But if you end up on top of that aggregation site, you will catch bass hand over fist, because they really do stack up in defined areas. So we might need to think about maybe having catch and release from, say, that closure, whether it be in November and December through till when things go into the reproductive mode. But the science suggests that as long as fish get back in the water pretty quickly and are handled well, that those animals will reproduce. We've done some of that work in Illinois, where I did my PhD in ponds there. We've even done simulated tournaments early season before the fish had spawned. We saw slight delays in reproduction, but that was a full-on tournament, not catching bass, admiring it and letting it go 30 seconds later. So I do think there's some creativity that we can bring to our fisheries. I think there's something else we can do as well. We don't need every bass in a lake to reproduce. There's possibilities to create areas where we pick the best bass spawning habitat and close it for that reproductive period entirely, not just to bass, but to pike fishing when you still catch bass, to bluegill fishing, say 30% of the lake, but then open up the rest of it to a full, to everything. So you can go and catch bass year round in that other area. So you protect the spawning areas, let them serve as a net exporter of baby fish, and see how that goes. Because right now, even though it is illegal to fish for nesting bass, there are not many charges that stick. Certainly with cell phones now, it's a little bit easier when people post pictures themselves posing. If you stop to take a picture of a bass pre-season, then you're not releasing it as quickly as possible. You are retaining it, and that can lead to charges. But otherwise, it's really quite unenforceable. You can't blame somebody for going and fishing tube jigs, in shallow water for big perch. And they happen to catch a bass. They occupy the same habitat. And there may be people that don't know. There are some people that go pike fishing and might choose baits that, aren't the obvious bait for pike, but they're pike. You can catch pike on virtually anything. So you can't just, slap somebody with a fine because they're using soft plastics pre-season. So it's a tough thing to enforce. So that idea of having partial sanctuaries, it's a trade-off, right? You can't fish here at all between May 1st and whatever date we'll say May 1st to end of June, but you can go and have fun in all these other parts of the lake. So that's something that we're thinking a lot about these days.
Oh, that's cool. That's interesting.
We've talked about on this program, and certainly Pete and I have discussed it openly about the sound management tools that we have at hand here in this province, in this country, as a matter of fact, and how successful some of them are. But more and more I'm hearing, and certainly from our own field experiences, I would tend to agree with, to a certain extent, that sometimes we can overmanage a fishery, and sometimes it kind of backfires, and sometimes it hurts the species as opposed to, help it perpetuate. In terms of bass, we may be at that point. I mean, you just mentioned something really interesting, that the vast majority of bass that are caught are released. And that is why we have such an incredible fisheries in terms of numbers. I think bass is the most prolific swimmer in our waters, freshwater system. How do you feel about maybe, well, let's call it selective harvest, if you will, selective harvesting, but maybe taking some of the bodies of water that have got too many bass and consequently they're stunted in terms of size, and making a little more room for them? Is that even something that you guys are looking at in your studies?
Yeah, certainly the idea of trying to manage for different things. Some water bodies you might want numbers, other fish, other bodies of water you might want size. The challenge is Ontario. The challenge is the fact that we have 10,000 lakes. We have just an amazing amount of water, and we have about 250 regional fisheries biologists. But guess what? They don't just manage fish. They also manage wild turkeys, aggregates, so gravel. They have to deal with everything. And so the idea that we can manage the lakes on a lake by lake basis is just simply impossible. I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about maybe identifying, a couple handfuls of lakes that we manage in perhaps a different way. But I want to emphasize how difficult a job our fisheries managers have. It would bankrupt us as a province if we did annual fisheries surveys on on even 1,000 of those lakes. They're extremely resource intensive. So we manage at a landscape level, and that's why we have these zones. So you pick an area that's kind of similar, it has similar geography and ecology, and you kind of manage to the average. And so you're going to have some lakes that are winners and some lakes that are losers when you apply the same regulation across a landscape. And that's essentially what we do. And it's brilliant in many ways, because it's taking advantage of the fact that resources to do these things are not unlimited, but it is also imperfect. And the people that devised this system are very smart, will also acknowledge that's the challenge. But yeah, picking some lakes, whether it be maybe a couple in the Kawarthas and a couple in the Rideau and elsewhere, and saying, hey, maybe we want something different. Maybe we want to manage for trophy fishery, and to do that, we do need to harvest fish. And I think that I don't eat largemouth, but I'll have a feed or two of smallmouth over the season. They're absolutely yummy. And so selective harvest is, I believe, we also shouldn't shame people for wanting to eat fish. We live in a province where the waters are largely clean, and where they are productive enough that there's nothing wrong with having a good meal. There's nothing better than playing your part in the 100-mile diet by eating locally.
That's true. Yeah, that's a great point.
There's a guy with us who joins us every week, a good friend of Pete and myself, and we've had the pleasure of working with him. His name is Ted Putnam. He's the owner of probably one of the best walleye fisheries north of Bay of Quinte, Hawk Lake, and he's done a pretty remarkable job of raising. And I say raising because he has total control of the assets on that body of water, except for maybe a couple of locals that fish it. But he's got a total 100% release policy on that body of water. Now, normally you would think, and Pete and I have experienced it mostly in Western Canada, where especially Alberta, where they manage their fisheries like with an eyedropper. They really manage it hard. In most cases, it's zero retention on all these walleye lakes in Alberta. And we've been on a few of them. Calling Lake is one that comes to mind, where you can't drop anything in the water without 10 walleye fighting over your bait. The problem is they're all stunted. They're all like they've got a regular, they got a regular head, but this little wee tiny body, because there's just no food. They're predating on themselves. They're cannibalistic. They got nothing to eat. So there's a case where it's been overmanaged and actually hurting the fishery, and yet Hawk Lake, Ted's place, I don't know whether you've had the pleasure of working or fishing on Hawk Lake, but it's nothing short of mind-boggling, the size of the walleye in that lake. So how do you account for that? How do you explain that?
Yeah, this is Mother Nature, and she's mighty complex. And I also want to say that we aren't as good at doing our job as the public thinks. It is very difficult. If you ask me, what's the state of the bass fishery in Big Rideau Lake? I can tell you that anglers tend to be happy, but to actually answer that question, it's not, you can't just look at the bass. You have to study everything, and you have to study it across seasons, and you have to study it across years. And so it's really, really quite tough. We end up making a lot of guesses. So the guesses that I would make about Hawk Lake would be that there's some pretty amazing forage. There's probably some refuge there that the forage is able to use in parts of the year. I'm going to guess that maybe there might not be the same competitors that are elsewhere. But there may also, mortality can come in other ways as well. We always think about mortality being fishing mortality, but if you throw on a mask and snorkel and go hang out in the shallows, there's a lot of dead fish out there. And that's not because of oil spills or anything catastrophic. That is also Mother Nature. Every fish, I dare you to find a fish that doesn't have some kind of parasite or pathogen on board. And if they go a few days without food, and their immune system starts to slip downhill, those things will take over. If they get scratched up by an osprey that comes in and unsuccessfully tries to capture them, and they've got a scratch on their side, opportunistic pathogens will take over. So disease pathogens play a really important role in helping to balance our fisheries. And so even when we're not harvesting fish, there is natural mortality that occurs behind the scenes, oftentimes very cryptic, and it plays a really important role in helping to balance these systems too.
I'm gonna go off of Ted's Lake for a second, Hans, because Stephen just brought up something really good. So what about if that fish has a parasite or something going on, he's not running optimum, you put him into a net, or a lot of guys, you see these guys slinging it into their boat and landing on the carpet, and it takes the slime coat off the fish. Is that fish got a good chance of dying after something like that?
Yeah, so a lot of the catch and release studies that have been done look at very short-term mortality. So did it survive? Was it hooked in a really bad place? Yes or no? And you hold it in a net for 24 hours. The challenge there is that most of these external infections, so fish get that, it's called saprolegnia, and it's a ubiquitous water mold, and it's everywhere. And so yes, if you scratch a fish up on its surface, whether it be with your hands or boat carpet, 3 to 5 days later, they tend to develop that fur coat if their immune system is compromised. So it's certainly one of the reasons I like to emphasize keeping fish wet, using slippery surfaces. So using rubberized nets as opposed to, the cheapest nets tend to be the worst for the fish. Those polypropylene nets tend to cut them up quite a bit, remove a lot of slime. I try not to put fish on boat carpet. I think about what we do for our research, where we work with vets to help refine our practices. We use measuring boards that are V-shaped. It's a V-shaped trough, and it's lined with yoga mat. So yoga mat is you can buy them at the dollar store for like $5. So you can buy a yoga mat that you don't want anything that's got fancy antibacterial properties or anything in it. It's thin, it's really smooth and slippery, but at the same time, it doesn't absorb the slime. It's not like a sponge that actually sucks in that slime. We have it wet. We measure our fish in there, and because it's a V-shaped trough, we can actually put water in it. Early in the season, that's not as big of a deal when the water temps are cold, but come later in the season, if it takes us 30 seconds to measure a fish, put in a tag, and record a few things, if those animals are air exposed for that time, they're in rougher shape when we go to release them, and they'd be more apt to develop those fungal infections. So yoga mats are soft, slippery, and we make them wet, and that's what we use to try and make try and improve the likelihood that those fish will not develop those fungal infections 3 to 5 days later.
Angelo, you're gonna have to cut up your yoga mats now. What the hell, buddy? You're gonna, geez, you poor guy.
I've got one I want to replace, anyways. I'm just trying to figure out how I can write off the expense. That's all. So it brings me to my next point I'd like to make. We field this question on a regular basis, whether it's via internet or emails or when we do live appearances, etc. You always have the naysayer out there who says, yeah, you guys have made a living from talking about live release and you're taking advantage of it and all that stuff, when really, the truth of the matter is that, live release, those fish die anyways. Like, what proof do you have? What proof do you have that all those fish that you release on Saturday mornings on your show actually live? What's the answer to that, Stephen?
Yeah, the vast majority of fish survive catch and release. And there's little things we can do to make it so that it's even better. And so that's where we spend a lot of time. There are situations where almost all the fish do die, but they're very specific, and it usually relates to predators. So, for example, I've gone fishing in Auckland Harbor in New Zealand, and it was a charter, and it was entirely catch and release. And the charter captain was adamant about having to put all the fish back. And every single fish we put back was predated by a bird. Pelicans, they would dive down and grab them. So I'm positive that our survival rate that day was 0%. I do work on bonefish in the Bahamas, where there's a reasonable shark population. We see 20 to 30% of those getting whacked by predators within a couple hours of release. We've done work in Kiribati, the Christmas Islands, and there the sharks are thick, and you cannot keep a fish alive if you've treated that animal to the point where it's tired. That animal is toast. The sharks are just swimming around you, just waiting to consume them. So it usually comes down the places where we see really high mortality. It's almost always driven by predators. The other place where we see high mortality is in high temperature events, when it's truly starting to push fish to their limit. So that's the reason why in some places in Eastern Canada, we have closures for Atlantic salmon. So when river temperatures hit 19, 20, 21 degrees, depending on the system, they'll shut them down in an attempt to reduce mortality. In this part of the world, so, Ontario, the Midwest, the biggest thing that determines whether or not a fish is going to survive a catch and release event is where it is hooked. That's the single biggest driver. And you can imagine that a fish that is hooked in the jaw, or if you want to call them the lips, whatever, those fish do very well. And the fish that are hooked in the gullet, or the throat, tend to do pretty poorly. Now, I'm going to guess that both of you tend to rarely catch fish that are really deeply hooked. It's probably pretty uncommon, but it's really uncommon with novice anglers, where you fish with live bait and they may be oblivious to the fact they've got a fish on. The bobber's halfway to the bottom of the lake before they realize that they've got a fish on. Meanwhile, that bluegill or walleye isn't just chewing on your bait, it's starting to digest it. And that's where there's opportunity for things like circle hooks to come into play, where you end up with shallow hooking, or if you do get a fish that's deeply hooked, all the science has been done suggests that it's way better just to cut the line and let that fish go, and they'll in due course get rid of it. If you try and remove that hook when it's in the gullet, you're fishing around in the same area as the heart and the liver, and that fish will most likely bleed out internally. Even a deeply hooked lure. The other day I was fishing with my kid and with a chatterbait, and a pike inhaled it, right to the gullet. Despite it being an actively retrieved lure, we cut the line and let that fish go with that lure. And we've done research where we've tagged the fish and the lures and shown that pike are able to get rid of those lures and still survive after a couple days. So fish are remarkable as long as we get them back in the water quickly. And I'm worried more about, as you said, this idea of scratching up their external, their body, their skin, their scales, and then you get that infection later on. But I would say around here, fishing in, for walleye and bass, you're looking at, high 90s in terms of survival percentages, barring a few exceptions. Barotrauma, where fish come from depth, is a bit different. If you hold those fish at the surface, especially in live wells, and you don't fizz them, those fish are going to have a challenging time getting back down, which is another issue we could talk about. But you should not feel guilty at all about going and catching and releasing fish and doing a good job to take care of those animals, so they've got a strong likelihood of swimming away and reproducing, growing, and being there to be caught again.
Well done. Well done. And a great segue to Outdoorsy Gal, who wants to know, how do you feel about fizzing a fish?
So we have fizzed fish, and we've done research on fizzing fish actually up in Rainy Lake. Used to be some tournaments there that had quite a bit. It was smallmouth tournaments, and a good number of those fish came in with barotrauma. The challenge is doing the fizzing early enough so that those animals aren't struggling the whole time that you are in a tournament context, having them in a live well. If you can catch a fish and get it back in the water very, very quickly, that eliminates some of the barotrauma issues. Fizzing certainly works, and I know it seems a little bit unpalatable to many, but when fizzing's done right, there's not any science that I'm aware of that suggests that there's any long-term harm. You're giving the fish a fighting chance, because if you do not, if you put a fish back that cannot get back to depth and struggles on the surface, and we saw that on that Rainy Lake tournament, we had fish that had their eyes eaten out by seagulls. We had fish that were struck by boats. So you want to allow them to get back to depth. I think the worst case scenario with fizzing is that you either hit something, but there's lots of great guides out now that help you landmark and know exactly where to do it. Everybody's got a smartphone with them. A bunch of groups have created plasticized little cards you can keep on your boat to remind you where the place is. And the other thing is, you don't have to let out all the gas. There's no need to take it down to empty. I like to fizz the fish in water in a cooler or live well so that you can see those bubbles coming out. And so you let a few of the bubbles out, then you take your hands off the fish. If the fish can right itself and isn't bobbing up and upside down, you don't need to keep going. You don't need to completely empty that swim bladder, and those animals will be able to get back to depth. And we think that the swim bladder heals really quite quickly. These are small gauge needles that are used. That muscle tissue immediately comes together around where that puncture wound was, and we think that the swim bladder just tends to be a pretty resilient organ.
Have you ever done? Sorry, Angelo, I'm going to go on this one a little bit. Have you ever done a study on a quick release of a fish without fizzing, but he's possibility of barotrauma? When he swims back down, do they decompress slowly? Do they swim right down? Is it dangerous for them to plop right down to the bottom real quick to go back to 35 feet, let's say? Do they know enough to naturally go, or do they need to decompress in their own way and stop, like a diver does? Is there evidence?
It has not been well studied with bass, but it has been well studied in the marine environment with things like rockfish. So off the West Coast, down in Oregon, where we're talking about not 30 feet, we're talking about 200 feet. And there they often use milk crates, weighted milk crates, to help get the animals back down, because it also protects them. When they're in the milk crate, on sort of in it being pushed down, it prevents other predators from coming in. And in that case, they do tend to take them right to the bottom. The depths that we deal with around here, unless you caught a smallmouth or a largemouth in 20 feet of water and then took it off to and drop it off in 300 feet of water, I don't think it's a big issue releasing them in or over reasonably deep water. Only if they're super tired, if they're really exhausted, are they going to just go and sit on the bottom. Fish swim, bass swim, and even when and we talk about largemouth bass just hanging out under logs, they're still swimming. They're just swimming in place. So these animals are going to start moving around. They're not going to just rocket to the bottom.
Do have you ever? I'm sure you have. Do you document your fizzing? Have you shot video of your team fizzing fish?
Yeah, I have not, but Bruce Tufts has. So Bruce is doing more work on the St. Lawrence. On the Rideau system, we tend not to see as much barotrauma. On Big Rideau, we'll get it now and again, but most of the work and the places where we've been doing work lately, we haven't had to. But Bruce has a number of projects underway that involve fizzing, and he'd be a great guest.
Well, he's scheduled to come on the show, but I'm just thinking in terms of visuals that we can post on fishingcanada.com. I think one of the problems with fizzing is that most people are a little bit concerned that they don't have the expertise. Like, where do you stick this needle? And yes, it's great to have an image on a card and all that stuff, but to be able to see it on video, I think would be really valuable. So, Pete, maybe you and I can focus on that this year and see if we can't get something on video that we can post, because I think it would go a long way to helping people.
Yeah, because we need the help in it too. We've only attempted it very, very few times. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So we got the needles, we got all the stuff, but we're hesitant on doing it. Like Angelo says, I don't know if I want to poke that fish that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe we'll reach out to Tufts and see if he's got some video that we can post on here, because I think it'd be great. Can we see that Ted Putnam message up there again? Because I thought it was brilliant. There we go. So Ted Putnam from Hawk Lake says, a rule of thumb, when you finally get that fish out of the water, which we do not promote, and he doesn't, by the way, hold your breath. And if you are holding that fish beyond the point of you holding your breath, you've held it way too long, which is fantastic. Great idea. If only we would all use that, right?
Now, Ted was right on that one. I think Ted was wrong on an earlier one. I'm going to call Ted out on this, and I'm going to get Stephen to maybe hopefully prove it. He said, why would anybody fish for the largemouth or smallmouth on the nest when the bigger female is waiting? But we have been told lately that the males of smallmouth are bigger than the females. So
what do you say?
How about this? The males get long and thin, but substantial, whereas the females tend to get more rotund. So they invest in egg development. And if you catch a female that's full of eggs, she's certainly going to be heavier than most males of the same length. But we see some really beastly looking dads, on nests as well. It's really difficult to sex bass. You can sex a bass with relative certainty about a week before they spawn, the females, because they get rather plump. I dare you to ever squeeze a bass and have eggs come out. It does not happen. I dare you to strip a male and see sperm come out. It does not happen. So almost all of the work we do is guessing. That looks like a male. That one's nice and long and thin. Or they came from a nest and it's already got eggs, so we know it's not actively spawning, so that's a male. It's very, very difficult to sex these things externally. When we say in the summer, on occasion we do research where we have to kill fish. When we guess in the summer after the reproductive period, we're about 40-60. We can, it's not quite like guessing. We're just slightly better than guessing at it being completely random. So, yeah.
Wow.
It's difficult to tell them apart.
That might be a first right here. We just witnessed a first, and I appreciate you sharing that with us, because, most of us just automatically assume like you guys know everything, right, when it comes to fish. But that was a great comment. Can we get that, Tim? Yeah, Sturgeon.
Thanks, Teddy. Thanks, Teddy, for that. Look at Ted said, hi. He's rubbing it back into me like that. So, Ted, just don't sex fish so much, Ted, okay? Because I know you got a bit of a problem with that, too. So, smart enough.
Tim Sturgeon wants to know, what are your greatest challenges, Steve, on your work? Is it funding? Is it finding locations? Is it finding maybe help? Personnel, like what's the tough part about your job? Because most of it looks pretty damn good to me. Okay.
Yeah, certainly the fundraising side of things. So we write grants to government, to various funding bodies. We develop relationships with fishing clubs, sometimes with philanthropists. We work with industry partners. I do a lot of work with British Columbia Hydro. They're one of our biggest funders. But for a lab our size, we operate on a budget that's somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million a year in an average year. So it's spent a lot of time shaking the tree. So certainly resources are one thing. And then everything that goes along with research. It's not just, oh, we got money, now we can go start. It actually starts well before that. So what are the ideas? What are the topics? And we try and co-create those with the end users. If we don't just go do a study and then try and shove it down government's throat, we partner with government. We'll partner with Muskies Canada. And right from the beginning, identify what we need to do, how we're going to do it, figure out how we're going to get money for it, and then we do it together in partnership. But building partnerships, good partnerships, takes time. They're relationships. And so certainly that front end, and then all the permitting. We need the permits from different levels of government. We need to get approvals for animal care. We have to have safety plans in place, make sure everybody's got the appropriate training. And we are also, it's all about learning, right? We are professionals, but we are training the next generation. And so not everybody in our team knows everything. The idea is that they develop their skills in-house. So making sure you've always got capacity, because I can't always be there. I'd like to pretend that I could be in the field every day, no matter where my teams are, but that can't happen. So sort of have that expertise spread across the group so that they can support each other. So that's on occasion it's catching fish, but we've got things like electrofishing boats and nets if need be, and we'll call upon anglers when we need them. So
I don't imagine you have too many problems calling those people out to come and help you. I'll tell you that right now.
Pick me.
Exactly. A couple of things. First of all, if I don't ask you this, I'm going to hate myself. So I'm going to put a star beside it. This is not the appropriate time, but I will ask you before we let you go today. But let's talk about tournaments for just a moment. There has been certainly last year was one of the worst years I can recall in terms of mortality rate for tournament fish. Up until then, I really was, I was one of the ones patting all of us on the back and saying, what a great job we're doing. And wow, we've got this thing under control. Everything is working properly. And then all of a sudden last year, just seems like everything was going wrong. We had more than one occasion, but certainly one that sticks out where we had, I believe, 400 bass died in a weekend tournament. Do you guys look into that? Is it like a crime scene for you? Like, are you called on to somebody say, hey, get Cooke's team down here and see what happened? Let's do forensic.
CSI Carlton.
Like, do you work on those kind of things at all? And if not, why not? Because that would have been a perfect place for you and your team.
Yeah. So if we're talking about the same instance, I'm quite confident we are. That organizer reached out to me and we had several phone calls afterwards. Okay. And I provided my input on what I thought some of the issues were. I think one of them was the fact that fish were being weighed in an area that was quite warm in a shallow harbor, yet these were mostly smallmouth that were coming from deeper, open, cooler waters. And so you've got a temperature shock there for animals that are already challenged. The other thing is there was an awful lot of ice used, and bagged ice cubes that you would buy at the store. And guess what? There's chlorine in there. And exactly. So I think a little bit of chlorine mixed with those water, partly driven because ice was being used to try and cool the water temps. I think that was the issue. So I think it was probably a poor choice of weigh-in location, and then just some icing the water works, but you don't do it with bagged ice. You do it with 2-liter pop bottles that are sealed that you pre-freeze, for example, or you freeze lake water and then you let your lake water melt. So there are ways to do this that address some of those issues. But I'm going to guess that it was, at the end of the day, it was chlorine that was the causal agent there.
Wow. The chlorine, sure. We've talked about this Peter and I at length when we're questioning on it, what, because we did it growing up in the tournament, early tournament era. We tried everything. I mean, we thought we were scientists ourselves. We were putting chemicals in the water.
We pour that blue shit in there, and then the water turned all blue. And you look about 10 minutes later, all your fish are belly up. They're all like they're stoned or something. Like LSD. Like what the hell? So
we kind of grew up in that era of experimenting, and when we heard about the temperature conditions on that particular event, and that everybody was scrambling to get ice, we knew right away that you can't introduce, even if it's in the bag. That bag has got a hole in it, and water gets out. And the minute you introduce that much chlorine to a confined area, it's a disaster. But even so, having said that, here's my personal take on this. We have spent enough time in the field doing exactly the same thing, trying to keep fish alive during really adverse conditions, heat, and we've used chlorinated ice cubes, and we've used all this other stuff. I've never seen such an instant massive kill in all the years that we've done. And keep in mind, Stephen, we were doing tournaments when live wells were first introduced, and our weigh-in procedure used to take 2 hours. So these poor fish would be sitting in these warm puddles of water and I have never experienced a kill off like the one that we're talking about. So I don't know.
What though? You know what, Ange? You remind me of the old days though. Maybe one tournament a year would be on Lake Ontario with smallmouth. All our tournaments back then were all largemouth.
Kingston Open.
That's the one tournament. I'm saying, but all the other tournaments, think about every other tournament that was won. None of them were ever won on smallmouth back in those. This is 30 years ago. You know what I mean? This is a long time ago. We fished largies, so we bring them from shallow into shallow, so it was probably a lot better. We're a hardy fish too. So, but still, it's interesting. It's just a shame.
There's a thing we use, and it's stressors rarely act alone, and so there are a series of things. So maybe at the end of the day, it was the chlorine that knocked them off, but those animals were probably dealing with barotrauma. It was in the heat of the summer, and so those surface water temperatures where they're being held in the live well are already warmer than what was at depth. And then if a weigh-in site is poorly managed, and you have those other issues that all come together, maybe on a good day, maybe if it was just largemouth, that little bit of chlorine probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But all of these little things add up, and at some point you push fish beyond a threshold where they just can't handle it. And it's remarkable. The gills are an incredible organ. They're that interface between the fish and the water. But fish need oxygen, and they need a lot of it. That I told you before how we measure fish in those water-filled troughs. We do work on salmon in British Columbia. If we just use a water-filled trough, we fill it with a new bucket each time and tag a salmon in there 30 seconds, that salmon will die. If we do not pump water through in real time, we have to have a huge bilge pump pumping water right into their face at high speed, or they will die, because they suck the oxygen out of that volume of water that we're working in so quickly. And once you're beyond that threshold, there's no coming back. So that was really when I did my postdoc at UBC back in 2002 to 2005. That really helped me understand how sensitive fish are and how close to the edge they are as it relates to oxygen. And that's why we see winter kills too, right? And
you know what? That can open the eyes up to anglers too, and that running your live wells. A lot of times people want to save their batteries. You don't think that aerator on a timer is that important. You should be running your live wells almost all the time. If your batteries can handle it, just keep it going, because that's oxygenating the water. It's giving that nice flow for these fish. I didn't realize they needed that much, but that makes a lot of sense, obviously. Right?
I have to add something here too, because for a while people were putting oxygen canisters in their boats. There's also, you don't want to rolling boil. There's also so much something such as having too much oxygen, where you give the fish air embolisms and gas bubble trauma. So you want, in an ideal sense, you're holding the fish in the same conditions they came from. So those ambient conditions, you're not trying to make it 10 degrees colder. You're not trying to add 3 times more oxygen. It's just keep it stable. And so I like to run my live well continuously with the aerator going. And I never stop. And if that means you have to buy more expensive batteries or wire your system up differently so it can handle it, so be it.
Perfect. Love it.
Let's just quickly deal with Jason's question there first, but I've got something more on this live well thing. Jason wants to know, what's the deepest depth that you've seen smallmouth?
Yeah. I can't say I've seen them with my eyes, but it's data. So we put transmitters on fish that tell us not only where they are, but some of them have depth sensors on them, pressure sensors. And so we've recorded smallmouth down to about 75 feet. That's the that's the deepest that we have data that shows that they go. So that's pretty uncommon. Certainly 30 to 40 feet in the summer, fall, even winter, is pretty common. In the spring, they're much shallower, probably average depths of 10 to 20 feet, probably right through till about now. Now is when you start to see them really going deep again.
What about largemouth? You ever heard anything about really deep largemouth? Because that would really blow a mind if they really get
30, 40 feet. And again, that being anomalous. Yeah. But winter is everything's different in the winter. I can't tell you what makes a good winter aggregation site. We have yet to figure that out, but we do know they're almost always associated with deep water. It doesn't always mean it's going to be the deepest area in the lake, but it's not the habitat you would go for and ever say, I'm going to fish for largemouth bass here in the open water months. There's something unique. There's probably something going on with groundwater, with currents. Who knows? Same thing in rivers. We've done work in the Grand River with Nelson Murakami and the folks at Natural Sports. He runs a bass derby, and we tagged a bunch of the fish at the Grand River Bass Derby, and we tracked them over the winter. And there were 2 or 3 spots in the Grand River where all these fish, they would come from 20, 30 miles away and stack up in these, a single pool. And we would look at it and say, doesn't look special to me.
I love that.
The reason I was laughing is, we're talking to Dr. Stephen Cooke, probably one of the most, if certainly in the top 5 scientists in this part of the world with regards to freshwater fishing. And he just says, who knows? I love it. I love it. You're human. All right, let me talk to you first about a better live well. With all of your experience in trying to keep fish alive, have you ever sat down or maybe late at night when you're lying in bed and said, yes, I've got it. This will make for a better live well? And if so, can you share that with us?
Yeah, some of the early work that we did at Queen's Biology Station, we put cameras in the live wells. And we did that with largemouth and with walleye. And we exposed them to wavy boat conditions. Admittedly, we did it on a pontoon boat, and we had these fake live wells set up. And we drove the pontoon boat in circles and go crashing through our own wake to simulate waves and so on. And basically, the largemouth were pretty good at being able to hold their position without constantly schmucking their heads against the tank. Not so for the walleye. The walleye, basically, every time there was a wave, walleye head whack into the wall. Whack, whack. And it's one of the reasons we think that during stormy tournament days or days where people run quite a long distance with walleye, those are the days where we tend to see high mortality. With smallmouth and largemouth, it really, I think it's, and so for a for a walleye, maybe padding might be useful on the inside, or some kind of baffles that help to mitigate some of that wave action. For largemouth and smallmouth, though, I think it's just anything that can be done to ensure that those oxygen levels are up. I also think that the more we can leave them undisturbed, the better. We haven't done research on this, but I've always wondered if fish would be better in individual compartments, you know, and you knew in terms of culling too, right? I know that the fish in compartment 1 weighs 2.6 pounds. And when you catch a bigger one, you can swap it out without having to dork around with marking them. But it also prevents you from having to go in there. If we want to get baseline stress values on fish, we hold them in darkened chambers overnight. A live well is a darkened chamber. And if a fish is treated well while it's in the live well, if you just put one fish in there and leave it in a live well for 6 or 8 hours, you know how hard they are to handle, right? You can't get your hands on the fish to put them in the transfer bag. They more or less recover. And so I wonder about just holding them individually so that we're not constantly disturbing them. That would be one thing I've mused about, but haven't studied yet.
That would be fascinating.
There you go, Ange. You're going to put 5 live wells in your boat now.
Yeah, no, but think about it. 5, 4, maybe 6-inch wide slots.
Yeah.
You know, as opposed to one big long one, you put 5 slots. I think that'd be great. Okay, yeah. I'm marking that one down. I'm taking that one.
Patent it quickly.
How important, and I'm, putting my reputation on the line here because I just recently wrote about this particular subject in one of my blogs. But how important is pH to a fish?
Yeah. Aside from not exceeding its tolerances on a day-to-day basis, I would say it's reasonably unimportant.
Explain pH for everybody, please, first, Stephen.
Right, pH. Okay, so essentially it's the extent to which water is acidic or basic. And so 7 would be neutral pH. In other words, something like distilled water. Something that would be really basic would be something like baking soda. And then something really acidic would be battery acid. And both battery acid and really basic things can burn you, right? You can get burned on both ends. And so fish, every species, every population has sort of a narrow window within which they do well. So admittedly, pH is something we tend not to measure in our lab, only if we were doing something where we were working in a system, maybe studying ocean acidification, where we thought that was a specific issue. But in the lakes around here, in the Kawarthas, in the Rideau, I don't think it really fits much into fishing or fish health. It matters if you get up into some of the areas where we used to have acid rain, acid precipitation issues, where things became too acidic, and then they would lime the lakes to try and address that. But that was a very, unique local. I don't want to say too localized, but that was a very specific example. But it's not something that I'm thinking about a whole lot on a day-to-day basis when we do research.
We went through a phase, obviously, those of us that can remember going through the pH phase.
Years ago, they made some money on people too on that.
They got mine, that's for sure.
Stephen, here's one that prompt is not pH, but it's a prompted question. Let's go look at 10 feet, 20 feet, and 30 feet. What are the most visible colors to fish in those levels? Is there a difference? Is there a color that's more visible? Is there changes through the depths?
Yeah. So blue is what is apparently the most visible the deeper you go. And I don't claim to be an expert in this, but as an angler, what I care about is confidence. And so, and the prey fit, you see perch in 25 feet of water, you see perch in 2 feet of water. I'm going to throw a bait that looks like perch, if I'm fishing for perch. So I match the hatch, except I match the bait fish, I match the crayfish. But I fish with what I feel confident in. I'm probably not going to throw a bluegill pattern in 40 feet of water because bluegill tend to hang out in shallower water. So that's how I pick colors. I try and emulate what's going on unless I'm trying for a reaction bait with pike or something like that. And of course, there are no rules with fishing, right? If there are rules, if there's a rule book, the fish have not read that book, from what I can tell. So you also don't want to follow the rules too closely. You don't want to listen to people like myself or even Pete and Ange too much, because there's always exceptions when it comes to science, and there's always exceptions when it comes to fishing. Just because we tell you never throw that lure in this time of year for that species, fish will surprise us.
Exactly. I love it.
You just blew my career, buddy.
I love that answer, though. That was good.
Kenny wants to know, do you only study the one type of fish? And obviously the answer is no. If you study walleye, can expect a show like this based on walleye. Can we talk about walleye more? Obviously he wants to know. Or are you just a bass guy?
Yeah. So in our lab, we work on all sorts of species. So I've already mentioned how we do a lot of work in British Columbia on Pacific salmon. We do work in bull trout, trying to help BC Hydro reduce the number of bull trout that get sucked into turbines. We try and help bull trout get past fish ladders. We do work on sturgeon in the Ottawa River, trying to identify optimal habitat restoration activities. We're doing work in Hamilton and Toronto Harbor on walleye, bass, pike, goldfish. We've even tagged goldfish to try and understand where those invasive species hang out. And then we do work around the world. We've got studies that we've done on Mozzie in India, an amazing sport fish, bonefish, barracuda, permit in Florida, tarpon, sharks throughout the Caribbean. So, if it swims, I'm interested. I like fish. That's why I love fishing and I love science. And so rarely will somebody come to me and say, hey, I've got a question. Would you be interested in studying this? Unless it's really outside of my wheelhouse, there's a strong likelihood I'll say, yep.
Okay, so
go back to Kenny for a second. So Kenny, we're talking a lot of bass because tomorrow is the opener and then next Saturday is the opener. So it's kind of right on everybody's mind right now. So just if you weren't here early in the show, that's what we were all talking about. So go ahead, Ange. Sorry.
So this is one that has been haunting me personally for 30 years.
Oh, and, my.
And you'll, as soon as I start talking about it, Pete will say, oh, yeah, well, me too. So, and I'm thinking 30 years. Pete, you'll correct me on it for sure. So here's the situation. During a tournament years ago, Pete and I found in this, I won't tell you where, and I won't give you any details, in this very large body of water that had very little contour in the bowl of the lake, right? The big part of the lake, just big, flat, deep lake. Very deep lake, by the way. Tremendous bass population, but all relating to shores and islands. Pete and I found a mid-lake hump that was totally isolated from anything, literally out in the middle. And it was just one of those phenomenons that we just stumbled on purely by accident. And it was massive. It was not a mid-lake hump. It was a mid-lake mountain that topped out at 13 feet and sloped down to 60 plus feet on all sides and very vertical slope. So it was a mountain, right? We found it by accident, and it held the mother lode of all mother lodes of smallmouth bass. Every size, every shape of smallmouth, it was incredible. And it held for 2 days. It actually held for 3 or 4 days because we stumbled on it inadvertently during pre-fish. Didn't sample a whole lot other than we knew there was fish there. So during the event itself, we went in, 2 boats went in. So 2 teams of anglers went in, and it was, to this day, one of the best smallmouth fishing I've ever experienced. And in fact, we ended up second and third. Should have been first and second on that tournament. Was it not for another situation we won't get into? But we ended up second and third, and we've never seen so many fish in our lives. And of course, Stephen, as you could surmise, we went back to that place, continually from that point on for about a decade. We never caught another fish. How do you explain that? How?
What time of year?
Summer, August, probably. From July or August, one of those two.
Yeah.
Midsummer.
Yeah.
Hump topped out at about 12, 13 feet. It wasn't a shallow hump. Gradually dropped off to 30s and plus and 50s, whatever, like that. So
down to 60s.
Yeah.
All big boulders too. Big, nice big boulders.
So certainly in large water bodies, smallmouth bass will school up and be somewhat nomadic. You've always got the smallmouth bass that lives under your dock, but there's a whole bunch of smallmouth bass that cruise. And there must have been some confluence of events that brought those animals there, whether it be currents, whether it be, I'm going to assume temperature had something to do with it, maybe storm event, but season probably mattered as well. I doubt that, maybe it's probably too deep for spawning even at the crest. So I'm going to guess that I don't know if you've ever gone back there in the fall, but I'm going to guess that it could be an interesting transitional habitat or not. It may have failed you then as well.
I've been back under every single condition possible, every time of year possible, and it just hasn't happened. Now we for the first little while we were racking our brains. Did we destroy an actual civilization of bass that lived on that hump? That's where they lived, because they were so far away from shore that maybe there was just that 50, 60, 100 fish that called that home, and we somehow screwed up their whole deal. That was the first thing we thought of. And then we thought of, because it was a very unique presentation that we discovered out there, and a unique color pattern we discovered out there, that we later found really emulated a certain crayfish that would have been found out in those areas in terms of color, shape, and the presentation itself. So maybe was it just that we hit that schooling smallmouth population that had gone out there, because every year they go out at that exact time and point where the crayfish have migrated up, maybe from the bottom of the lake to the top. I don't know, but we've tried to come up with every possible scenario and never discovered it. And now
going back, because that's that's the mysterious part about fish. And that's, I've mentioned telemetry and tracking. We do a ton of that now. It's been around for 30 or 40 years, but we got pretty serious into it about 10 years ago. And it's really revealing all sorts of mysteries. Everything we used to know before was based on just where we saw fish. We set a net here and we caught fish, so this is where they must be. Or we'd put numbered tags in their back. And if, I tag it here and you catch on the other side of the lake, 2 years later, we draw a line between the two and say, well, that's where it swam. Yet we know that they don't travel in a straight path, and it's probably traveled hundreds of kilometers in that period. So these telemetry tools that we use, and some of them are quite tiny, as small as a grain of rice now. We've tracked round goby with tags, electronic tags, right up to tags that you could put in sturgeon or sharks that last for 10 years. And every couple seconds, they'll send out a ping to our listening stations, and we're able to figure out where these animals are. And we're seeing really crazy things. We're seeing carp that we tag in Toronto Harbor picked up in the Huron-Erie corridor. So they've gone all the way through the Welland Canal, all the way through Erie, and they're heading towards the St. Clair. So there are these completely unexpected movements that we're observing that, just weren't even on the horizon. We didn't even know how to study these things in the past, or we wouldn't have believed them. But with our telemetry, you can see the animal pinging as it just like, okay, there it goes, and it's there's the next lock on the Welland Canal. There it's on, as it works its way through. So it's quite remarkable. And as an angler, it's also helping me understand the types of habitat that these animals are using, and that it's not there's always these unexplained patterns that why did they all go off there for, we don't know, but we know they did. So yeah.
Is there like a segregation of fish, nomadic fish versus stationary fish? Has there been proven something like that some fish just are born to travel, that's all they want to do?
Yeah, we call them movers and stayers, or recently it's actually been thought of as in terms of personality, not just with fish, but within animals. And they range along what we call the shy bold continuum. So the shy fish tend to be the homebodies. They're afraid. They don't want to get eaten. They're less likely to go after a new bait or a new food item. And then you've got those animals that are way more bold, more exploratory, more into risk taking. They might have a greater chance of getting whacked by a predator, but they're also going to grow bigger and probably reproduce more. And so there are these trade-offs. And so if you take a bunch of bass and put them in individually in a kiddie pool, we can test them and evaluate their boldness. And you get that whole spectrum. You get fish that are totally shy, and you get fish that are really bold. And what's cool is we've done some work on some of the sanctuaries around here, and the fish that we pull out of sanctuaries, some of the ones on Big Rideau have been in since 1940s. Those fish are so bold. You can throw the kitchen sink at them and you will catch them. They behave entirely differently than the fish in the open lake environment, where presumably through time, the easiest fish to catch, those genes have been removed from the population. So not all fish are equal. Fish are unique as individuals. It's not just there's a population, they all behave the same way. Every fish is different. And I don't want to humanize them when I say personality and imply that they have feelings or can feel pain, but they certainly have a range of behaviors, and it's underpinned by physiology too, different metabolic rates. Those bold animals have way higher metabolic rates. Their heart rates pump faster or are faster. And guess what? You got to eat more to keep that up. Right. And so they're easier to catch. So pretty neat stuff.
Wow, that's awesome. Oh my God.
I remember have a conversation I had with Mark Ridgway 5-6 years ago. And I believe I might have given him that example that I just gave you with that hump and what's going on, Mark, help me. He was like my therapist, right? And during the process of our discussion, he said that on Opeongo, where he does a lot of his work, they have tagged smallmouth bass that regularly travel 40 miles, from spawn to summer haunts and wintering homes. 40 miles is not out of the question. For us, we think about that and we say, whoa, how can that little creature travel such a great distance, right? But in the same token, he was also telling me that the vast majority of the fish that they work with have got a 10-mile range. So it basically goes with what you're saying. There are those explorers, those fish that are just naturally different. They're bold, as you call them. So,
Any new revelations in muskie? Anything with that you can say that you've learned in the last couple of years that's kind of an eye opener with I know they do a lot of muskie research near Ottawa, apparently, right, in the Rideau or something like that. So, is there anything that they're in that world?
Yeah, a couple things. We've done some catch and release work with Muskies Canada and showing that the standard handling procedures that are used by specialized muskie anglers result in very high survival. So people that know how to handle muskie, aside from that odd fish that gets hooked in a really bad place, tend to do really quite well. We don't think that's necessarily the case for a more novice angler that goes out with a medium heavy spinning rod with 8-pound test and, might not have the pliers or end cutters with them that they need. But at least for the specialized anglers who do catch the majority of the muskie, those fish do very well. We've also done some juvenile pike and muskie in the Lawrence on the U.S. side. Found that even in the winter they stay pretty close to where they were spawned, to those natal spawning bays. They move out to slightly deeper water, but they don't take off. There's no mass migration. Staying within a couple miles of where they spent their first summer growing.
That's interesting too. I like that.
That's great.
You never know with a muskie, right? That fish is in the St. Lawrence is 40 pounds, 50 pounds. It's got to eat a lot of food, but you know what? That food's coming down to them a lot of times too. They're stationary and all that food's flowing to them in the current, right? So that's pretty cool. I like that.
You mentioned something earlier on about age. What, there's all kinds of theories on how old this fish is and that fish is. What's give us some age information on fish, would you?
Yeah. So, things like largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, anywhere from 15 to 20 years is sort of the biggest fish that you'll find, the oldest fish. The easiest way to tell is to think when you're catching small fish, you can start to assemble the year classes in your head. So, so right now, just staring off my dock this morning, there are bass, smallmouth down there that are about 1.5 inches long. So those are the fish that were spawned last year at this time. Then we've got another group of fish that are all about 130 millimeters, which is, I don't know, what's that, 3 or 4 inches, 3 inches or so. Those are the year before, and so you can start to assemble the year class. It starts to fall apart when reproduction happens, because then they slow down their growth as they invest more in reproduction. But most of these fish are getting to, sort of a catchable, if you want to say, sort of a 11, 12-inch, 1 pound size by probably year 4 or 5.
Wow.
If we're 3, 4, 5, if we're talking about the Kawarthas or Simcoe or the Rideau system.
What about those big lake trout in Northwest Territories? That 70-pound lake trout. Did he hit 100 years old, that fish?
Yeah, there's some evidence that they do get really, really quite old. And one of the ways they've been able to validate those ages is because they've been around so long. They were there for some of the early nuclear testing that was done. And so when the US first started throwing nuclear material into the atmosphere, that serves as a time point, a marker in their otolith. So you can go back and look for that nuclear signal. I think it was it the Trinity explosion back in the 1940s, I think, was sort of that biggie. And they're still able to detect that in some of the Lakers. So, which is an interesting way to validate these ages, because you can't hold a lake trout in a tank for 100 years to validate that it's actually that old.
Yeah. It's all, a lot of the things that we do and say, a lot of the things that you do and say, are because these are natural environments that we're working in. These are living organisms that are wild. There's nothing that is 100% in stone. As I said before you came on, the only thing that we use is experience. We know that, out of 100 times that we've done this, 75 times, here's the results. And we can share that with people, just like you're doing in your studying, right? Here's what we have found by our studies. But at the end of the day, this is a living organism, and it's alive, and it's out there doing its own thing and has its own set of rules that it lives and dies by every day. So, it's not perfect. That's what I'm trying to say.
Is there a species of fish, aside from Chinook salmon, that lives a very short life in Canada, let's say? Is there, like an 8-year-old fish or 7, and they're usually done by? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, certainly things like bluegill might get up to 10, 11 years. But, I think most of the jumbo perch you're catching are probably, 4 or 5 years old. And a lot of the small-bodied fish, things like, the minnows that you'll see, golden shiners or darters, things like that, they might only live 3 or 4 years. So it's really, some animals sort of live fast, die fast, and others are in the long game. So, yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
I just want to play off what Ange was saying. And as a professor, whenever I stand up in front of a class and I'm talking about biology, everything I say, I'm lying, because there's always an exception. There's always an exception. And it's always in your head. You don't want to, hey, well, here's an example, and this is how the world works. But in your head, you're like, but there's all these exceptions. And so, and it certainly works that way with fish as well. And if you think about what biology is the study of the variation of life, the diversity of life. And that's not just, how is a mushroom different from a human? It's how does that bass differ from that bass? So it's diversity of all forms, and it's the variation. That's what makes things fascinating. And it's also what makes everything complicated. There's no standard thing that this is exactly how a bass will behave. This is exactly how it will grow. So there's always those averages we work towards, and we're always in error because of that, because we're always shooting for the average, and there's always going to be animals that perform more poorly or perform better or differently. And that's what makes it fascinating, but it also makes it challenging.
Oh, yeah.
What's your favorite bass catching presentation?
Certainly frogs. Throwing frogs, topwater frogs. I love flipping a good undercut bank. Big Rideau is not the best for that. In terms of lures that have performed in an outstanding way recently, over the last few years, certainly chatterbaits have been a game changer. Less time picking weeds off spinnerbaits. I used to love throwing spinnerbaits, but a bit of a pain. And then I do love a buzzbait bite. When the buzzbait bite is on, it's on, is amazing. But when it's not on, why bother? So but you got to try. It's one of those things where I always have a buzzbait rod, and it's another one where I also don't want to follow the rules too much. I don't just wait till those overcast days with a little bit of chop. Every once in a while, I'll pull it out and chuck it midday in a hot day, and sometimes the bite is on. So yeah.
Have you ever caught? This is funny you're saying this about going back to the chatterbait now, because I've been talking about this all week with friends. Have you ever caught a real big or consistently big largemouth on a chatterbait in Canada, in Ontario, let's say, or is it just a numbers bit? Yeah.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Is there
the work we're doing in the sanctuaries, admittedly, where we're tagging fish in there to look at movement in and out. So it's somewhat unique and a bit unfair because
there's all sizes of fish too. Yeah. So okay, because we've been talking a lot, and it's a great numbers bait, and a great numbers bait. When you get that 3.5 pound, 4 pound range, it's almost like you're not getting those 5s in there, and those high 4s and 5s and 6s on chatters. But you're saying you have done it, so at least you're the first guy.
But again, it's a very targeted, specific thing. If I were to think about the normal fishing outside of those areas, and not as much. Yeah, it's more of a numbers game, and I like to fish them when I'm with my kids because you also catch a whack of pike with them too. And when you're fishing with kids, it's the fish that matter, not the species so much.
Right on.
Stephen, you're already blowing a few of our theories out of the water. We might as well, let's make it one more. Why not? For years, people like ourselves have been saying that fish become conditioned to baits, and that message is somehow embedded in their DNA, and it's passed on to their offsprings through genetics. And what used to work, I'll give you a good example of where this first entered into my mind. The Kingston area, white spinnerbaits used to be the bait of choice for about a decade. If you weren't throwing a white spinnerbait, you were not catching fish. Whether it was Henderson Harbor or out at Amherst Island, didn't matter where it was. If you weren't throwing white spinnerbaits, you weren't catching fish. And then just as quickly as that developed, it shut off. And you cannot get a fish on a white spinnerbait. Do you believe that fish become conditioned to certain baits and actually have the ability to pass that on to their offsprings?
Yeah, two things. So first of all, I'll suggest that maybe other things changed as well. For example, what they eat or the environmental conditions, such that that bait was no longer the optimal bait, that those fish were still there. They just weren't looking at that as food anymore. Not that they weren't hungry, they just didn't consider a white spinnerbait to be food. So that's one possibility. We don't know about the genetics and whether it's passed along, but we do know about individual fish and their catchability. We've done some work with Atlantic salmon in Norway, in the River Alta, where every fish that's caught, the anglers have to record the size of fish, the lure they used, and so on. Wow. And we know there that a fish that's caught once, and these Atlantic salmon are caught over and over again in a season, there's a much stronger likelihood that fish will be caught a second time on something different. So if they're caught on a fly the first time, The second time, they're almost, it's almost impossible to catch them on a fly, but you might get them on a spoon. So, and then some of the work that we've done here in nesting bass in Eastern Ontario allows us to go back to the same nests a couple of years in a row. And because there's nest site fidelity, if there's a fish back in that same nest site next year, it's likely that same fish. And in fact, we use little tags so that we can know that. So we can present that same fish with different lures at different times throughout the spawn, and you're more likely to catch, if we have standard lures we use for doing that. So we use a white jig, a floating and a black plastic worm. Just 3 simple things. And if you were to go back, if you were to try that Rapala 3 different days in a row and you caught the fish the first time, you'd be extremely unlikely to catch the fish on Rapala the next go round. We've then come back the next year and said, hey, can we still catch them on a Rapala next year? And you can. So there seems to be a limited memory for that. So across the 3-week spawn or 4-week spawning period, they do retain that information and say, whoa, I'm not interested in that bait type. I'm either afraid of it or, it's not food. But over the course of a year, they regain their trust, if you will, in that bait again. So that's as much as I can tell you. It's interesting. But you also, I'm sure you've had those exceptions where you catch that same fish 3 times in the same day on the same bait. I've done it with a rock bass at my dock here. Same bait, just 3 times one day.
That's what I was going to ask you. How long, what's that period of time? So an angler's got that one stump where a big largemouth lives, and he just caught him this morning. How soon before he can go? And he released him, put him right back. How soon before he could feel confident in going back to that fish?
Yeah. So if we look at what we know about the stress response and how long it takes animals to recover from a catch and release stressor, most things are back to normal after about 4 hours. Metabolic rate stays up a little bit longer, but by 24 hours, everything should be back to normal. They should be, they'll resume feeding certainly at or before that point in time. It's usually 3 or 4 hours that they kind of sulk, where, they're clearing the lactate, where heart rate's still elevated, where their blood pH is off. But it doesn't last long. As long as they get put back into good conditions that they're used to, they can recover quite quickly. So I would say that it's theoretically possible to catch them as quickly as 3 or 4 hours later, but easily within a day or two. Again, I wouldn't necessarily go back and throw the same bait, but I would certainly go back. If you were fishing a tournament and you knew there was a 5-pounder behind that stump, I'd go back the next day.
I'll tell you another thing with the tournament. A lot of people do this is they find the release sites where they're dumping all those live release fish back, and these guys are pounding them next day. You know what I mean? Or 2 days later, if it's a 3-day tournament, they go in and they get their limit like in no time. So it proves that these fish will bite again. They might not be using the same baits, but they're still eating. So,
yeah.
Robert Devonshire wants to know, and he was up here earlier on with that question. Wants to know your thoughts on cormorants and how they pertain to fish and fishing.
Yeah. Yeah. So our lab's done a fair amount of work thinking more broadly about predators and their role in ecosystems. And this is, in Ottawa right now, we've got a couple problem coyotes causing grief for the public. But predators play a really, really important role in structuring populations. They're the ones that are going to eat the sick individuals, the sick fish that are otherwise going to go back and interact with the other fish and pass disease. So there are not a lot of natural predators around anymore. We don't have ospreys to the same extent. Thankfully, we still have them, but they aren't as plentiful as they used to be. We don't have snapping turtles. And I don't want to give you an impression that snapping turtles are violent predators, but they'll take down a fish that's not doing so well. Otters not nearly as plentiful as they used to be, and it sort of goes on and on and on. So For cormorants, I know they're not necessarily preying on the biggest animals, but they still are playing a role in the food web. My issue is that we have yet to see the science. So the province has failed to share the evidence that there is a problem, and B, that opening up a 50 bird bag is the way to solve it. I think there's some serious safety issues that exist as well. It's only a matter of time before a kayaker gets wiped out by somebody shooting at cormorants. Cormorants they're not like a duck that flies up. You scare a cormorant and they fly low to the water. So people are going to be shooting vertically. So there's horizontally. So there are a number of issues that just sort of don't shake out for me. We've got that expertise. You mentioned Dr. Mark Ridgway. He is our expert in cormorant fish interactions in this province, and we have not heard from him publicly on this. And so that tells me that there's science there, and it's not being shared. So it's something I've put in my post to the Environmental Bill of Rights, asking to see that evidence. So at this point, I can't tell you whether I'm in favor or against the call. What I can tell you is the evidence that has been used to come to that decision has not been publicly shared.
Wow.
Okay.
Wonderful. I mean, obviously Mark's studying it. As the government hiding it? I mean, that's because they know there's such an issue here, right? I mean, I'm not asking you, Steve, when I'm talking to Hans on this one here, because it's such an issue, and they know that there's so many people. Well, there's a lot for they don't want the people that don't want to kill any animals, and there's a lot of us that say, oh man, they're doing devastation to us, and we got to get rid of them. So it's a touchy subject for sure.
I think the pandemic is hopefully helping to get everybody on board with this idea of evidence. And evidence comes in various forms and qualities, and that we want to follow the evidence. With healthcare, we don't want to do what we think is right. We want to do what we know is right. We want to use the best evidence to make the best possible decisions on how our resources are managed for the public good, on how we allocate our resources, our limited financial resources and personnel to tackle these issues. And that's where, that needs to be done in an open and transparent way as well. So I'm hoping that as people realize how important evidence has been to guiding our response to the pandemic, that we can and should demand the same when it comes to managing our natural resources.
In keeping kind of with the something we touched on earlier on, and I see one of our regulars, Calvin, he's more than a regular, he's one of the family. Calvin Pennell is on with us today, and he's an ex-Navy guy, and so spent a lot of time with sonar, and he's commenting on the site about the amount of chatter and noise that goes on down below between fish. And as I'm reading that, it prompted me to ask you a question. Do you believe fish do communicate? I'm talking freshwater fish. Obviously, whales and dolphins with their sonar abilities do, but can a bass talk to another bass?
Yeah. So some fish do have the ability to generate sound. Others do not. It's more common in marine fish, where you need to use that to find your friends and your lovers, if you will. So a lot of the fish that aggregate, so think about things like Nassau grouper and a lot of the snapper complex off of Florida, they make an awful lot of noise. In fact, fish biologists, instead of using nets, can put out hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, record that noise, play it back, and identify species and abundance from that chatter. Wow. So the answer is yes, but around here, it's much less common. A largemouth bass does not need to make noise to find another largemouth bass. So it just sort of depends on the local context. And so some places, yes. Most of the freshwater environments around here, not so much. Freshwater drum, which are related to some of the drum species that we see, anatomically similar to some of the drum that we see off Florida or the Gulf Coast. They certainly make noise. I'm unsure whether if an animal makes noise, it's usually for a purpose, even if we haven't studied it to know exactly what that purpose is. But it's usually mate finding. is the usual reason.
Okay, we've always had the fear, I have had anyways, and I've shared it with Pete, that when you release a fish, it has the ability to alert everything else down there and makes fishing tough. Any truth to that?
Admittedly, it's something I think of too.
Okay.
No science on it, but they certainly will have. They swim differently, and they probably smell differently. So it's that those subtle changes in behavior and odor. So they are going to be immediately clearing things from their gills and their skin that give them a scent trail, if you will. That's why we think that the sharks can hone in on, like, we release a bonefish in a school of other bonefish with the hopes that that will give that fish a fighting chance. And you can watch the school part, and poor Billy the bonefish, who we just released, is left alone. And it's able to, the sharks are able to pick up on that scent trail and zone in on them. And so I know sharks are unique and have incredible sensory capabilities, but other fish that we see around here are also able to detect injured conspecifics. Conspecifics is a fancy word for the same species. So if you injure a perch and take it, you can take a dead perch, take its skin and mutilate the skin, put it in a blender, create like a skin juice, pour that in the water, and it will change the behavior of those perch. That's called an alarm cue. So they will say, whoa, something's gone around here. There's an injured perch. Was it just eaten by a predator? What went on here? So there's certainly ways in which these animals communicate, but it's probably again in these more subtle ways. So yeah. So if there's also the splash, right? My kids are horrible for that. I'm like, oh, 3 bass just followed us back to the boat and I caught one of them. And so we'll measure, tag, and release that one. And my kids fight over who gets to release the fish. And of course, it's never it's more of a dramatic splash that I'm always after. And it seems to always be right where I last saw those fish. Sometimes I catch them again. More often than not, I don't. But I think I also lose my confidence. I've in my head said, I'm probably not going to catch those fish. So that's part of fishing too, as you know, you can psych yourself out.
Yeah, and I think people have to realize that they're watching here, we're obviously talking about schooling fish too. So if you catch a largemouth in the set of pads and you're going 50 feet away, and you release that one, you're not going to be affecting that. Yeah, it's the close-knit schools that we're talking about here. So
yeah. Although I also think there's way more fish in those pads than we know. It's partly because of the action cameras that everybody has, GoPro style cameras. We throw those, in the water all the time now. Sometimes we use them for research, but we use them more for fun. And my God, there's a lot of fish under there that we are not catching. A good pad bed. And I know we've got fancy polarized glasses and we're paying attention and fishing it, really strategically. There's a bunch of fish there that we are not catching, that aren't hungry or not interested in what we have to offer. So even in places like that, I think I don't want to call it a school, but I think they're stacked up more than we think. If your listeners and viewers have one of those cameras, it's worth playing with them underwater. Deploy them on your, wherever you fish, and come back and pick them up an hour or two later. Just see what's there and see how the fish are interacting with each other. I've learned so much just from watching fish. You can also do it, as I said, with just a mask and snorkel. You don't need fancy scuba. Just throw on a mask and snorkel and spend time in the water watching those fish. You can also fish with a mask and snorkel, which is kind of fun too, and watch how they interact with those different bait types.
Did we not have somebody ask that question, Pete, just recently on one of these, if it was legal or if they couldn't go down?
Yeah, I think you're right. We did. So there's no legal repercussions to it. Obviously,
to my knowledge, no. Fishing is about an activity that involves a rod, reel, and hook, or line and hook. There's no rule about whether or not it can occur from a bridge, a boat, the shoreline, or in the water.
Yeah.
Another myth that you might be able to, put to bed for us. We've been certainly talking about it for years. Do fish sense sonar?
Yeah, probably not. There are likely some fish in the world that have those capabilities because there's 30,000 species and there's always exceptions, but it's not something that I would be concerned about. We've done work in the North Sea off of Norway where we look at blasting behavior or crazy sonar that's used to search for oil reserves. And we see even there with the noise and disturbance that's created there, very little disturbance of the fish. Fish are pretty resilient to noise in their environment. We were talking about noise earlier and whether they can sense each other or hear each other. We've been studying boat noise lately and its effects on fish and found very little going on with the fish that are in our part of the world. Part of that is the fact that soft bottom absorbs that noise and acts as a bit of a filter. But also we think they're just sort of used to it. And we've tried going to one of the research lakes at Queen's Biology Station where they don't allow motorized boats. And we've taken fish from there and exposed them. So naive fish that have not heard boats in their lives, expose them to motor noise, and they're reasonably indifferent to it as well. So at least in this part of the world, I don't think that fish care too much about noise.
There you go, Viola. You can run the big motor and you can run your sonar over those fish and they're still going to eat. He's ridiculous out there. You got to turn this up, turn it down, get the trolling motor, turn it down to low, and do that. Oh my gosh.
So you have to appreciate this, okay? I'm super paranoid about sound and how it affects fish. Now, my partner for years, my brother Reno, was the opposite. In fact, he had a theory, and you know what? It was hard for us to dispel that theory in most cases. He had a theory that when you race into a back bay and you come off plane and shut that motor off and throw that first cast out there, you get a fish right away. And it's happened to all of us. That first cast, boom, wow, they're in. You don't see another fish for an hour. His theory was that fish heard the sound, was curious, and came to you, and you caught him. Whereas we're afraid of that. He was never afraid of noise. He believed that noise was a good thing because it actually got their curiosity up. The fish said, "What's that?" And more often than not, he would prove it to be correct.
The way that we've been able to study this lately is we use nesting bass, and so we've got speakers that we've bought that are meant for synchronized swimming. So it's the speakers that blast sound underwater so the swimmers can hear what's going on and keep up with their routines. And so we record boat noises and then we play them back on this underwater speaker, and we do it right at the nest, a meter away, 2 meters away, up to a couple 100 meters away, and they do not care. They just care, and we know they can hear it. It's in the range of their hearing.
Thank you, Dr.
In the range of their hearing, and we can put the hydrophone right at the nest, so we know that the noise is getting to them, and they just continue to be like, da, 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 da. I'm a dad, I'm doing my thing. So that's how we've been able to try and study that.
Look at him. He's sitting back. He knocked him right back in his chair, Stephen.
It's not quite a good news story for the turtles. The turtles definitely do not like the noise, and it disturbs their basking. But for fish, doesn't seem to be a big deal.
So when my grandson slams the lid on my boat, and we're in a nice, 4 foot deep back bay, and I yell at him for doing that, I shouldn't be yelling at him.
Just shake your head instead. Yeah. It'll be hard to learn that one. Yeah.
I hope not watching is all I got to say.
Oh my God. It's brilliant. But you know what? This stuff we've been talking about so far, this is amazing. This is great stuff. This is absolutely fantastic.
What impact will global warming have on bait fish in Ontario?
Yeah, good question. I think right now, most of the work that's been done, and remember, this is all modeling, right? We don't actually know. We model things, and the species we know the most about are the game fish or the commercially exploited fish. We know much less about what those lower trophic levels, the fish food, will do. And it's complex because global warming might, in fact, influence the base of the food chain And that's what ends up cascading up and affecting the big fish. Or alternatively, maybe it's going to affect the predators, and that's going to cascade down and affect the lower trophic levels. So I think the short answer is we don't know, but I think we can expect change. That is, I think, the certain thing that is change. Changing environments. I think you'll see changes to the regulations and how we interact with fish. I think fish care will become more important. So we're talking about keeping fish wet, minimizing air exposure, those kinds of things. That's only going to become more and more important.
Stephen, all I got to say is, wow, you have
blown our minds.
Blown our minds for sure. I mean, I may never be able to fish again. I mean, that's
you're never going to be able to fish quietly again now, Viola, because I'm going to be banging around that boat as the Rockets or whoever that restaurant, banging and I'm clanging, I'm banging.
Yeah. You can play your music now. Yeah.
We have to run it.
We got the little lightning round. The boys did a little something for us in the lightning.
All right, let's do that first.
Hopefully, Mikey can throw that up. Okay, Stephen, so what we've done with every guest so far, we're looking for one-word answers on these next few questions that we have. Just a little simple one-word answer, okay? It could be a good question, a bad. Some of them are silly. So, okay, I'll lay some out of you, okay? What fish are more aggressive in freshwater? What's the most aggressive fish you know of?
Pike.
Pike?
Pike.
What fish consistently stinks worse that you have worked on? When you cut them open, is there a fish that stinks more than any other fish?
Pike.
Okay. Pound for pound, are saltwater fish stronger than freshwater fish? Pound for pound.
No.
Ooh, see, that's good. I like that because I always thought they were just whatever. What is sharper, Stephen Cooke's scalpel or his fillet knife?
Scalpel.
Okay. First off, on this, it'll be a two-part question. You're aware of the hydrowave system that the guys put in the front of their bass boats and it emits the little transmitter? Okay. Is that been scientifically proven to work?
Question mark. I'm unaware. I don't know.
I'll let you go on more one word. Do you think it could work? Emitting sounds like shad or this, etc., into the water with a speaker. Could that work on catching fish?
It could if there's species that zone in or that use sound for feeding. So we started going back to our previous discussion. So yeah.
Okay. The last question.
Whoa. What would Stephen Cooke fish with one?
I'm willing to do an experiment.
Got to give it to him for free. Okay, I'm taking one for free too. Okay, my last question, and I woke up 2 nights ago in the middle of the night thinking of this question for Stephen Cooke. Okay, everybody take note of this. Do fish fart? There you go. They do.
Yes.
There you go. Fish fart. You've answered my question that woke me up in the middle of the night. Thank you, Stephen. You saved it all.
That's a hell of a way to end the show, though. I'll tell you that right now. Listen, we can't thank you enough for joining us, Stephen, and not only taking the time to do it, but you're taking the time at the cottage with your family. We really appreciate you sitting in for 2 hours, which we didn't mean to keep you that long, but obviously there are a million questions. The audience has a million questions as well, and we'll have to bring you back on if you'll be so kind to humor us one more time. It'd be muchly appreciated.
Yeah, that was great, Stephen. Thank you. That was a blast. Yeah. We learned. Ange and I learned a lot, so I'm sure everybody here learned a ton here. Honest to God, it was that great information.
Yeah. I grew up watching you guys on TV, and being at things, participating in things like the Pro-Am in Kingston, and getting to rub shoulders with you guys. So this is a treat for me as well. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Buddy.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, man. You take care, Stephen. Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Good luck fishing.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Stephen Cooke, man, that was
pretty awesome, buddy. To me, that was.
I may never look in the mirror again. I can't face myself anymore. You can make noise on a boat when you're fishing.
And the fish are farting underneath you, for damn sake. What the hell's going on here?
I knew you'd all love him. He's a fascinating gentleman. I've been have had the honor of working with him on several occasions on the radio program. He's almost a semi-regular there. So some of these things that he talked about, I already knew what his answers were going to be. But fascinating. I mean, the thing about Stephen that I really love about him is that he is so brutally honest. And he hasn't let the whole professor thing sort of get carried away.
A real guy. He's just a real dude. That's all he is.
Who's been fortunate enough to do what he loves to do for a living, right? And,
the nice part is he's a fisherman too. Like, he loves fishing. He's teaching his kids to go fishing. He's doing all that kind of, you know what I mean? So
they all are. Bruce Tufts is another guy. I mean, loves assistant professor. He loves fish. He tournament fishes regularly, right?
Yeah. So and that helps us in the long run too. These guys are doing studies on. I know we got a couple, like the guy that asked about the walleye and stuff like that we're concentrating on bass, and that seems to be a lot of the studies that go on because the tournaments, et cetera, et cetera. But these guys do look at other species of fish too, and Angelo and I are just concentrating today more on bass because that's it now. These seasons are opening up, so people have to realize that too. But and it's a very interesting fish. Bass are very interesting, right? Very diverse. So.
If you're an angler and bass are not under your skin, you haven't been exposed to them. That's the problem, right? You need
not properly. That's for sure, right?
Embrace them.
And what?
You need to embrace them.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's no doubt about it.
All right, well, all of you would-be bass anglers, now that you're armed with all this newfound technology and information, courtesy of Dr. Stephen Cooke.
No cookbooks yet, Tim Sturgeon. No, Tim's asking about cookbooks. Nothing yet, buddy.
Oh, what's going on with that?
I don't know. We sent him something. I don't know. Somebody sent him a note, and he's ignoring us now. He's just
this is now getting beyond just. I mean, we need to take control here of the situation, and then somebody needs to go knock on his door. We need those cookbooks, you and I.
Jordan, we're going to send Jordan down there. He's going to pandemic here. He's going to go and scare him up a little bit.
All right, man. We got to run. We're into overtime.
Yes.
Oh, there's the live bonus code. Did we forget to give it out last week? I noticed a lot of guys afterwards saying, "Where's the code? Where's the code?"
There it is. Cooke. There it is, people. Cooke with an E.
Cooke. That's the code with an E. You got it.
With an E.
Mr. I will bid you an adieu. I will
bid you an adieu. And everybody, what's that, sir?
Are you fishing this weekend?
Yes, I'm going to go over the opener tomorrow morning, but I'm just going to go close by because I got stuff to do in the evening anyway. So I'm going to head out on Rice Lake tomorrow and give it a little shot. I want to get the boat working and all that kind of stuff like we did yesterday. You know what I mean? Make sure everything's in order, and then hopefully set a hook or two on a largemouth. I'm not going to try for smallmouth. I'm going to try for largemouth. What the hell? I wait all year for this, buddy. I haven't done it since November. You know what I mean? That's a long haul. So I got to set up that. So good luck to everybody else going out bass fishing tomorrow, and everybody going fishing at all, but especially you bass fishermen, because it is a long-waited opener for sure. So
I want to remind folks once again, fishingcanada.com, boat, motor, trailer giveaway, but not only that, also enter for the Mercury motor giveaway. So they're two separate contests. If you're not in both individually, you're not in both, period. So a lot of folks are still thinking that as long as they enter one of the contests, their name goes into both, and it does not. There's two separate contests that you must enter in order to be eligible for either or both.
It does. That's my Scottish buddies you say. It does nay. Instead of does not, it does nay.
It does nay. So fishingcan.com, enter contests, and off you go. Also want to remind folks tomorrow is Saturday, meaning that we'll be on the Fan 590 from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And if I had a list of the guests, I know one guest is going to be on with us tomorrow on the show, and that is Minister Tibolo, or Tibolo, depending on what part of Italy you're from, how you pronounce it, who's going to talk to us about mental health issues and during this pandemic and some of the issues that fishing and being outdoors may help us with. So an interesting subject matter.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think we bid everybody an adieu. Thank you very much for joining us. Have yourself a wonderful weekend. Get out there, but play it safe. We'll talk to you next Friday. Take care.